Hi, welcome to the Agent Odyssey. My name is Matt Wyman. I am a co-founder of a company called Acario. We do simulation to help stabilize your agents before they go to production. Today, I'm very excited to have Markus Lampinen here with me. Markus is a builder and founder in the AI space. And actually, Markus, why don't you tell us a bit about what you're up to these
Yep.
days?
No, thank you, Matt, for having me. It's fantastic to be here. So I've been working on data companies for a while. I'm a serial entrepreneur. Right now, I'm the CEO of a company called Prifina that creates AI twins that fit into your everyday life, augmenting you and helping you. I'm also an investor in a number of different companies in working with data, working with AI in spaces such as financial services, risk, geopolitics, and so on and so forth. I have a fascination for, obviously the AI products and such. But one of the things that I'm really excited about, Matt, is talking a little bit more about the human element. Like, where does
Hmm.
it actually relate to us as humans? And, how does that leave us better off in the future?
I'm definitely a fascination for me as well. Um, I took a little anthropology in school and have always loved it ever since. Um, I think I'd love to start with a bit of what you're doing at Profina and this concept of that digital twin, because this notion of the helper that represents you could go in so many different directions. And I'm curious, like first, maybe you can describe a little bit of where you think it's going and how you think it would best be used, and help people understand that as grounding.
Sure. The foundation of Prefina is that users should have control over their own data. And as an extension of that, they should be able to use it themselves in all sorts of AI, agentic, large language model applications now and in the future. That was the heart of the company when we set it up. Now that means that we have two products out there. One is the AI twin, which we call an AI product that augments you to your network. And then we have a personal AI that we're rolling out right now, which is more your own agentic helper, more for you to manage, everyday tasks, your own household staff of AI twins and whatnot, what you might have. So the AI twin that we've had in the market for the last couple of years, it's basically something that you teach. You decide what it knows. You essentially control its brain, so to speak. So you get to play brain surgeon, which is fun. And then after that, you can place it as a sort of first line of defense between you and your external audience. So external audience might be your customers. It might be your colleagues. It might be your family. It might be your relatives at Thanksgiving dinner. It might be anybody that's essentially asking questions of you. But now essentially when you're not available or, you're on stage presenting, you're on a phone call, you're, for example, sleeping. Now, instead of waiting for you, they can essentially talk to the AI twin. And the AI twin, because it uses all of the coolest AI magic. It talks every language. It's infinitely patient and so on and so forth, which, we humans aren't. Um, then it kind of creates this, proxy where people that talk to the AI twin, they understand that you've chosen what it knows. So it becomes a representation of you. It's not you, of course, but it becomes a representation, an augmentation of you. And then for them, it allows them to get answers, when they need them, which, sometimes you need the human, a lot of times you don't. What it does for you as the owner is does a couple of things. One, it answers those questions that you don't need to answer, which is a lot of times it's hugely helpful already. It answers them in the recipient's local language, which is also great because they might otherwise not ask the question. But that's kind of the biggest takeaway that we've had, that when people realize that they're talking to software, they're not gonna self-censor as much. And
Hmm.
I may self-censor in a way that, if, for example, Matt, you're using our AI twins and you're giving me, the CEO, feedback on the product. I mean, you're gonna be nice. Like you're not gonna be 100% honest. You're gonna take back a little bit. You're gonna have this courtesy of being human. If you're talking to software, that goes out the window. And I say this in the most beneficial and positive way possible. Because if you have customers, let's say that you're a consultant And if you have customers landing on your website and they're not converting and you don't know why, I mean, that's a problem. If you don't know why your presentations aren't landing in a meeting, if you don't know why your client pitches aren't converting, I mean, this is information that it doesn't matter to you if it's polite or not. You need this information. So that's one of the biggest benefits that we've seen for the owners of these AI twins that augment them, that it kind of gives them insight that they wouldn't otherwise have. And it allows them to then essentially improve their offering, improve their AI twin, or it gives them the opportunity to essentially just utilize this information in a way that, you know, coming back to the start, makes them better off um, from where they were starting from.
It makes it more accessible. So I'm just going to stipulate for a moment. Let's jump forward and stipulate that this becomes very common. That whether it's through Prifina or another mechanism, people have these pairings and this toolbox and these companions, if you will, that they're accustomed to working with. And I love this notion of this household of AI staff. We should come back to that. But let's assume you have that around you. Then you go into the workplace. You're joining a larger company. That company has its own perspectives on AI, and on agents and workplace behavior, expectations, and whatnot. So it seems that there may be a future where there's some tension. What do you bring with you? What is given to you? And you're already leaning into this where I don't think most companies have a policy for how to manage this. So how are you thinking about the place of bringing agents with you versus adopting agents given to you? And how do you see us drawing that line?
Yeah. Like many things, it's obviously very case dependent and it's very multidimensional, if you will. I'll just give you a couple examples and then, I mean, we can come back to talking around them and around this topic. So, for example, one of the things that we oftentimes see is that in large companies, there might be customer service or sales reps that kind of become like almost celebrity profiles within that company. Like I remember at one open source company that does databases, there was this one guy that all the customers wanted to kind of get help from, Patrick. And the problem is that, there's only one Patrick, right? Like you can't
Hmm.
put him on every single client. So in this sense, actually, it makes sense to almost overrepresent the individual and augment them on an individual basis. But this is where essentially the company's interest in, having this individual also have their own individualistic tools becomes very aligned with the company's metrics or the company's mission. Because the reason that they want to talk to this Patrick, it's not because he's the best at his job. I'm sure he's fantastic, but it's not an objective measure, right? Like he's got this cult personality because he's been in the space for 20 years. Like they want to hear from him. So I think essentially that's where essentially the individual has more space in the enterprise. And that's where, for example, you could take the analogy that these types of profiles oftentimes are also overrepresented in many companies, for example, on LinkedIn. Like they might be a lot more vocal about their views and such, which is not the company's views, but so there's kind of like this aspect, which is you're already seeing this trend toward more individual marketing, if you will, within enterprises, where essentially the enterprise, they see that it benefits them directly. And then there's the other aspect, which is let's talk more about like internal tools that people are using. And I would kind of make the analogy that very similar to when you go to work for a large company, you have your personal cell phone, but the company and your personal computer, but the company will likely give you a work phone and a work computer. And the expectation is that they'll be able to control those. They'll be able to federate different types of data. And you do your company stuff here and you do personal stuff here. Sticking to the phone and the computer analogy, do we think that this is, like a very, very clear Chinese wall? So this is one of those things that even in today, outside of agentic and outside of all of this, fancy stuff, people are placing phone calls on their personal
Yeah,
phone.
it's unavoidable.
It's unavoidable. And even to the extent that in some military strategies, they've started kind of accepting the fact that they can't control not having personal devices. So they need to go the other way of essentially looking at like, how do they embrace personal devices? from like encryption and so on and so forth points of view. So that's one. But if you imagine like this third scenario, like how you as a job seeker might interact in the future. So let's say that, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, you have a person that's an expert in, I don't know, some type of quantum encryption. And they basically go in and they're seeking a role at McKinsey. And then McKinsey, has the interview. And then the person presents their AI twin where they put all their personal subject matter expertise, all their research, all of their case studies, all of this. And then the conversation is that, you know, McKinsey will license access to this AI twin so they can utilize this competence on demand. The AI twin will draft presentations, material, sales proposals, customer guidance, whatever. And the person behind it will be responsible for making sure that the AI twin is current, it's performing up to, the right standard and so on and so forth. Okay, you know, you might push back and say that, hey, Marcus, why would they ever hire an AI twin as opposed to the person? And my comment to that would be that, okay, well, why would you hire the person? Like the person will get tired. The person won't work 24/7, doesn't speak 190 languages. So what you want really is that unique aspect. And then the method of delivery, it might also change. So there's three scenarios for you, which are very, very different. And that's the point that I'm making with these is that I don't think it's going to be as singular as one black and white policy. I think you're going to have like a whole spectrum of different outcomes.
That makes a lot of sense. I think I'm sure we can come up with many more as
Sure.
well. But it also strikes me that we think about experience, where you perform a job, you learn, you go to a company, you spend some amount of time there, you gain knowledge, you potentially leave and move to the next job. Either you moved within the company, maybe you moved to another role, or maybe you left that company, moved to another company, but you carried with you knowledge. And of course, you cannot talk about specifics about how a company, this is NDA, there's IP and whatnot, but you can't help but carry knowledge from one role to the other. But now your example of Patrick is really interesting because the knowledge is going the other direction as well.
Hmm.
So Patrick leaves the organization to go on to do bigger and better things, moves to a new role, maybe as a manager, as a founder, who knows? However, all those conversations that Patrick had are feeding back into the system. And if Patrick was helping build a twin that was, for an efficiency standpoint, holding those conversations when Patrick was asleep, or doing three of them when he could only do one, but now he's doing three at a time and he's checking in to make sure each is moving smoothly. Who takes over that twin? Does Patrick have a right to carry some of that twin with him? Like, how does that relationship work? I mean, it is case specific for sure, but I think we have responsibilities on both sides as both employers and employees to think about, well, how do we start to have that conversation about where the line is and what we can take with us and what we leave behind in terms of information. And I'm curious how you're like, how have you been thinking about this?
I think you're absolutely right. Like on one side, we need to recognize that this is happening. And I don't mean in the future. I mean now, like this is
Yeah,
happening
right
now.
now.
So the question is like, there's the question of, I would identify a couple of different ones. One is brain drain in the organization. Like when people leave, how do you make sure that you retain as much of the critical competence as possible? Other one is knowledge transfer. Like when Patrick's replacement is trained, like they're not going to have all the charisma of Patrick, but they're going to be different. So how do they kind of get up on the job as quickly as possible? And then the third one is that specific AI twin in this regard. So a couple of different scenarios. I mean, on one side, you would hope that the organization and Patrick had this conversation before and they agreed to what's going to happen. Like that's an employment contract. But a couple of scenarios. One is maybe they've agreed that once Patrick leaves, then the organization gets to retain a copy of Patrick's AI twin. They can't use it in Patrick's name because Patrick isn't there anymore. They can't impersonate him, but they can use that information for brain drain, knowledge transfer, and essentially just making sure that the organizational competence remains intact. That's one. The second one is Patrick might get a copy. Like he might take that with him and he might develop it. Like you said, no IP, no trade secrets, nothing like that, but more about like his own skill sets that are going to be horizontal to his next role. Now, this is where it gets interesting. This might be a black and white cutoff. Like organization gets this, Patrick gets this, and they go their separate ways. What if Patrick negotiated a support contract? Because
Hmm.
he happens to know Patrick AI best, and he knows the ways of working, these horizontal traits that he's learned over the years. What if he then supports organization X, gets paid a couple of thousand a month to essentially go back and make sure that the AI twin, which is now used for knowledge transfer and internal brain drain mechanics or finding that brain drain, that could be a huge opportunity for him. So this is one of those things that I think in this way of like enterprise employee, I think that has an impact. But I think an interesting thing is thinking about like, would it possibly change the way that people just work in general? Like if you multiply this by 5 employers, maybe at that point, Patrick's already got license contracts for support contracts for these 5 employers where he's just maintaining these AI twins and this horizontal capability. Maybe that's now his full time. So there is this kind of trend with freelancing and contract work, which is anyway a large conversation in technology in general. But then when you put agents and AI twins and all of this on top of that, that becomes a really, really fascinating playground where you will probably, I mean, I'm sure that there's going to be like some molds that companies and employees fall into, but I'm sure that there's also a lot of opportunities for individuals to kind of make it their own. Because as long as you have essentially that type of competence and that type of expertise, now it could be everything, like it could be anything and everything. Like we have one AI twin owner that is, he is an expert on reindeer herding. And if you think about these, like that's a very specific skill set. So if you have a very specific skill set, I mean, that's probably going to be in demand in the future anyway. So if you are the expert on that and you continue to kind of flex that muscle, then odds are for a lot of organizations that sought you out, you could have different types of relationships also going forward.
I think this is interesting because you're also highlighting the importance of sovereignty and portability in the actual twin or this agent, because it needs to be portable enough that you can carry it forward, you can carry it with you. It has to be sovereign enough that it's outside of the the systems, if you will, of that employer. But you can also imagine that there's prior agreement. You take your twin with you, and the employer has maybe the opportunity paid to merge what's left behind with the sort of, I'll call it the baseline, right? Some baseline twin, some sort of common twin, the general. So Patrick was the specific person who did a phenomenal job, but maybe there's a general person that some element of the learnings get merged into, and maybe there is a residual. I mean, certainly in music, if you're a composer, there's residuals every time your music is played. You know, is it so different if Patrick is, if his residual knowledge is being used on a regular basis? Perhaps we can find a way to represent that and ensure he gains access to it and continues to have some control.
This is a fascinating topic. If I kind of just underline that residuals aspect, because my first company was in the data rights market. So we dealt with a lot of royalties and things like these. So imagine on top of that, on top of residuals, you put in royalties or different things like this. Like, could he even get paid on residuals? But one thing that, and not to kind of jump on the nerd bandwagon, but one thing here is that
It's okay, we're all nerds here.
if you think about like individual, like why somebody might talk to Patrick's AI twin, it's really because they want to talk to Patrick. Like they're not going to talk to Patrick's AI twin if they have the opportunity to talk to Patrick. Hands down, they're always going to talk to Patrick. But if they can't, then the next best alternative is not to talk to a logo. It's to talk to Patrick's AI twin, which is specific to how Patrick actually, what he knows, but also like how he disseminates information. And I'll give you an example. Like I had one of my colleagues, he was on a panel last summer, and a lot of he introduced his AI twin, and then a lot of people asked it questions. And then one of the panelists said that, hey, your AI twin's actually kind of rude. And my colleague was like, like, what's the problem? I'm kind of rude. And this is kind of the thing that this might sound like a very negative thing, but it's really not. Like you can put it into personality bucket. So then the question that I have for you is that if you take this, what makes us as individuals unique, sometimes for better or worse, but what makes us as individuals unique, and then you merge it to the mass like, large language model or trained corporate database, does that actually add any value? Because one of the things that the LLMs are great at in general in AI is looking at large data sets and finding essentially the mean most likely outcome. But Patrick isn't the mean most likely outcome. He's an outlier. And that's kind of
Yeah, the
the
vanilla is not interesting in this case, right? You don't
that's right.
want the vanilla.
So it's just interesting. Like that's one of the things that we see that people like to talk to people. And then there's a use case for those corporate AI solutions, absolutely. But at the same time, if you're talking about the human interface, then it's generally what people tend to gravitate toward.
I agree. And I think that, and I recognize that this can be scary for many folks, but this is the moment we're in where the learnings from Patrick's twin don't have to be isolated to just the data of the answer. It's not just how Patrick answered, or rather, it's not just the answer that Patrick gave. It was the manner in which the answer was delivered. There's elements of personality, elements of interaction model, of the pacing of conversation, length and word choice and phrasing. All these things are part of what makes up that conversation. So when I'm imagining a quote unquote merge back, I'm not assuming it's just the data, but it could be the case that that's the essentially the contract that we establish, that the personality can't be brought back, that it has you can pull the answers, but you cannot draw from the mannerisms, the interaction, the expressivity, and the other parts. And maybe that's where we start to draw some of these lines. And I do think that we have agency here, both on both sides. I think as people working in these environments, starting to build this household staff, which I'd love to talk about, I think it's part of our responsibility to think about, well, what part of this do we want to allow to be carried forward? And I think we do have leverage in that. And this is a moment in time to go figure it out and not just assume that, well, it's all just going to be taken from us. We should start to think, uh, uh, this is the part I carry with me. This is the part I carry. This is the part that I hold loosely. And I allow this because ultimately, if I'm working in an organization, I'm learning from the organization, but I'm also teaching all the people around me,
That's
right?
right.
I'm also help. So that information's fine. The personality carries, maybe. Now I start to think about that household staff because it's not just you and your twin. It's not just the one. We're building up a whole again, I love this idea. Like we're building up a whole group of people around us. So maybe you can tell me more about like how do you see that household staff? What does that crowd look like that you're carrying with you?
So I mentioned at the start that we have, as a company, we have two products. One is the one
Hmm.
that we talked about, which represents you to the outside world. But then recognizing that, when we had users that started using this to represent themselves to the outside world, then they started also using it themselves in like single player mode. So
Hmm.
this is where the second product comes from, which is then what we call your private use for this. It's really the personal AI. Um, and the way that we position it, it's kind of something that has a lifelong memory of you. It gets better over use. It's sovereign to you in terms of the data is all your data, all the outputs are yours, nobody else's access. But it's also essentially AI and LLM provider agnostic, which means that you can swap out and use best in class technologies, and you're not sharing data you're not sharing data that can be linked back to you with any type of company, which is
Hmm.
really
Okay. Sure.
so that's kind of the baseline. But then if you think about this, once you have this AI that gets to know you, it gets access to different information that you provide. It learns, it kind of reminds you that, hey, Marcus, you have a doctor's appointment coming up on next Tuesday, and here's the immunization forms that you need. Or it reminds you that, hey, actually, do you remember that last October when you were sick, you did this trip, things like these. The analogy that we have for this is really like a good friend, somebody that you learn to trust and somebody that you go to with different types of things that you're either working through in your own head that you want somebody to spar with, or then there's very specific tasks that it's doing. So think of these recurring tasks that come up with your life that you always like, I wish I had something that would take care of these. Like that's that. But there's it's easy to think of AI as one thing, but it's not one thing, right? Like it's a combination of so many different things in the background. So what we're already seeing is that this one AI persona that we've created to help you privately in this single player mode, then after that, it needs to correlate and, communicate and control a bunch of other AI agents. Because the moment that you go into the external world to send the message, add a calendar appointment, check the weather, whatever it is, that's when you're using another agent. It might be an agent that we build. Most likely, it's not going to be one because there's a lot of brilliant companies that are building all sorts of different cool extensibility into this. But our focus here is very much on very much on your personal use. So it's not a productivity tool. It's not something that helps you map out tasks or create, consultant reports. But it's rather those things that when you wonder, I'll give you an example. Like one of the things that I've loved looking at is this type of data that's really hard to surface. Like for example, nowadays when we have discussions with different types of AI tools, and you can even literally ask the question that when this happened, what was I thinking about? And
Mm,
you have the ability to answer that because you have data such as like, your history with different AI tools and what you've actually been brainstorming with them. And we didn't have that 2 or 3 years ago. So that's a fascinating dimension that we have. But the way that I kind of think about it is that if we fast forward 5 years and think about like you're going to have all of this, it's going to compound in terms of functionality every month, every 2 months, every 3 months. What's going to be essentially the human role and what's going to be all these tools that are extending you? And I think that's a fascinating question because then it comes back to almost what we talked about earlier with Patrick. Like, what is it that makes Patrick unique? What are those things that Patrick is, you know, brilliantly human in? And I think this becomes more of a question also, like how we as humans spend our time. Like, what is the most meaningful use of time for us as individuals, but then also for all of the other parties that we're in service to. So that's the way that I think about the household staff. That it's basically like it's almost like this. I have this one colleague that had this term of consumer counterintelligence. That it's almost like taking all the things that all the companies have and then just bringing it all into your household to help you.
yeah, yeah. Well, it also brings to mind for me those amazing relationships I've seen between executive assistants and the people that they're helping. And when you meet someone when that's really working, frankly, it's a very intimate relationship. And it's not just about work. It's about the entire person. It's about the entire life. It's about everything. And I'm always impressed with executive assistants who lean into that and really help so much in so many different areas. But it's not easy on the other side either to open up so much that you're able to have all those details of your life exposed and visible and being worked on. But it's a whole. You can't have it. It's not a halfway activity if you want it to work well. And then I think about some of this notion of the household staff, and there's that opportunity to start to think about all the different balls you're juggling and see how they all fit together, which then I think it further creates this interesting. I love this counterintelligence, consumer counterintelligence. You can suddenly be your own sort of have your own mechanisms you're leaning on that can help you interface with the world more efficiently, which is sort of obvious. But also, I love this notion of countering because it helps you counter some of the pressures that we all receive from the outside. We're always being pressured to use things more, go log in again, go do another post, we're being pressured constantly. We're not even aware of it. So maybe we start to build up this staff of people who help us stay focused on what we actually care about, what's important to us. And it knows that because it's been spending the time with us and
Maybe
sees the bigger arc.
Yeah, maybe it does kind of become a filter in that sense that it helps you find the signals for the noise. Because one of the hypotheses that we all have in the AI space is that there's just going to be a lot more noise going forward. But I kind of want to circle back to what you said about the executive assistants. That one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is the introduction. Like when you're introduced to this AI that's going to run your household staff, where does that start? And
Mm.
it starts with a very fundamental question, which is, Matt, what do you want? And I think this is where essentially on one side, it gets to the heart of the human experience. That that's not a simple question at every point. Like, what do you want to do? What are you focused on? Blah, blah, blah. But for it to actually play the part that you want it to play, then it will have to come back to this question a few times over the course of you learning to trust it, to ask, like, what do you really want? And that's sort of like the human connection too, that when you're essentially learning, like, what are your goals and so on and so forth. But think about it this way, that unless you get to that stage, how on earth is it supposed to help you? So if it doesn't have enough context and such, I mean, that's one thing, but if it doesn't have a direction. So I think this is something like, and this is, by the way, absolutely true for enterprises too and companies. Like you need to have this North Star because otherwise, whatever systems you build, I mean, they're not gonna really, they're not gonna really know where they're sailing. So I think that's kind of the analogy that there is this element where you have to kind of lean into that human like analogy. Like when you're getting to know this really, really brilliant person that's helping you in your career and helping you essentially grow as a person in your career and all of that. I mean, they do also need to know the answers to questions like what drives you? What do you want? Like what's your goal here?
Get ready to look in the mirror. I mean, a
That's right.
lot of our work with AI is let's 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 look at things with some honesty. What are we actually trying to solve here? As you think about that going forward, because I love that angle. What do you think people need to do differently, and what skills do you think people need to adopt to really be ready for this new world?
I think there's a fascinating trend with AI in general that we're kind of talking about all things digital and all things, AI and software and so on and so forth. I actually think like that introspection part, I think that that's super relevant because yes, you need to play around with the tools and yes, you need to learn about this. But one of the things that we've told a lot of folks that, for example, take an AI twin that become AI twin owners, we oftentimes tell them that, hey, part of it's just like figuring things out in terms of where does it fit into your life. And I think that's sort of like not being afraid to start and just kind of testing it out. I think that's a really, in a way, good part of this technology trend,
Mm.
that there's a lot of this iterative aspect, like you don't have to get it right. That's one part. But I think it's also this curiosity that what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of excitement, but a lot of tools. And there's a lot of excitement that comes to me. And my first question is like, fascinating. Did you test it? And then, I mean, there's a lot of excuses like I didn't test it because of X, Y, and Z, and so on and so forth. And I think that's one thing that, I mean, I get it. There's a lot of tools. You don't have to test them all, like, absolutely. But at the same time, if there are tools that seem interesting, then spending 15 minutes on setting it up and seeing if it works for you, I mean, that's oftentimes a no brainer. Um, one of the thoughts that I've been thinking about quite a bit is we ran a seminar about half a year ago, and as part of this summer, this was for a financial institution who was thinking about adoption of AI within their own workplace and so on and so forth. And I remember essentially one comment that somebody made after one of the sessions. And it was somebody that worked in the bank for a while. And they said that they get that they need to learn AI. They get that AI is coming. But why do they have to do it alone?
Mm.
And that stuck
Interesting.
with me because I think in a way, this is a software journey, don't get me wrong, but it is also a very human journey. So actually and one of the things that I'm really encouraged by, and I'm also very want to encourage in general, is creating these like small peer support groups, if you will.
Or interesting. Yeah.
Of like, just like a WhatsApp group or message chain or whatever, just brainstorming like what you did and, how it worked, how it didn't work, just speeding up the adoption curve. Because I think a lot of people are struggling with that aspect that there's so much noise. And it's also like, where do you start? What do you do? That's not an easy question.
Well, it's also a reflection of optionality.
Mhm.
So previously, you could assume that you would slot into a fairly well defined role with a title that's been around for some time, whether it was as a doctor, a lawyer, a software engineer, whatever the role is, you're going to slot into this role, and the boundaries are pretty well defined. Now the boundaries are blurrier, and you have a lot more optionality because you can reinterpret and you have help to go do it. And you can rethink how you want to approach that area, which again means you have to know what you're about. You have to know why you're doing things, but it's scary. That big open green field can be scary for people. So the notion of pulling folks together to lean on one another and find those smaller communities to tackle, that makes a lot of sense.
I think this is also true in the enterprise. That when you got folks that are struggling with these in big companies, I think this is also one of those things that, and I kind of call them peer support groups, but I mean that's really what they are. Because you get kind of drowned in this information, and part of it might be coming from the company, part of it from the market. There's always a new Silicon Valley company that raised $1 billion to do something, and it's gonna change the laws of physics. And that's kind of the way that the world works, but that can be very daunting. So, kind of coming back to the very practical aspect, like, okay, a talking head avatar, how would I use that? And realizing that I would not use that. That's valuable. Then you go on to something else.
Yeah, exactly. And being willing to try. I love that curiosity, the openness, and the willingness to make those human connections and not to be afraid to make the human connections to draw forward. Marcus, thank you for a fantastic conversation today.
Oh,
I
thank
really
you.
enjoyed it.
This was really fun.